When the bitter winds of winter howl through the mountains, survival isn't just about strength, it's about outwitting the elements. One prospector's secret method for keeping meat frozen through the harshest winter ever recorded could change everything we know about survival in the wild. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If stories like this captivate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals even more shocking secrets from the frontier. The world beyond the small shack was a realm of pure white. Snow fell in heavy, relentless sheets, blanketing everything in sight. The wind, a piercing, cutting force, whipped around the rocks and trees, carrying a bitter chill that sank deep into the bones. In this unforgiving landscape, survival depended not only on skill but on the willingness to do things others wouldn't dare. The ground, frozen solid beneath the thick layer of snow, could break the spirit of any man who wasn't prepared. Samuel Thompson had learned early that the mountains were no place for complacency. Raised in the rough hills of the Appalachian frontier, he had come to the Rockies seeking wealth and freedom. The discovery of gold was a call he couldn't ignore, but what he found instead was a brutal, uncompromising wilderness that had no interest in human ambitions. Many before him had been claimed by the mountains, their bodies left to the mercy of the wild. He had come to terms with the fact that survival here meant not just fighting against the elements but respecting them, learning from them. And it was in the face of this respect that Samuel had created something remarkable, a meat pit buried deep in the frozen earth designed to withstand the worst the winter could throw at it. This wasn't just a simple way to store food. It was a testament to the ingenuity needed to survive in a place where even the strongest of men were at risk. As Samuel crouched next to the pit, examining the meat carefully preserved beneath layers of snow and stone, the cold wind gnawed at him. His weathered face, grizzled with a salt and pepper beard, was a map of the life he had lived in the wilderness. His leather gloves were stiff from months of exposure, but his hands worked with precision as he carefully adjusted the stone cover. The pit had been Samuel's idea from the moment he realized that keeping food from spoiling during the harsh winter was a constant struggle. There had been close calls, meat spoiled despite the cold, scavengers picked at his supplies, and the risk of hunger was always looming. But this new method of refrigeration was something no one had ever tried. A deep hole in the frozen ground, insulated by the surrounding permafrost, created an unrelenting, cold environment that kept the meat preserved in a way that no ice or traditional methods ever could. It wasn't just the mechanics that fascinated Samuel, but the challenge of it all. No one would think of digging a hole this deep in the middle of the Rockies, but Samuel had seen the way the earth acted, the way the temperature fluctuated beneath the surface. He had studied it, tested it, and found a way to turn the land itself into his ally. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, distant sound, the crack of ice breaking somewhere further down the mountain, a potential hazard, but also a reminder that the wilderness was constantly shifting, testing him. Samuel stood and glanced towards the distant peaks, the treacherous cliffs that marked the edge of the valley. He had little time to waste. Survival in these parts wasn't just about planning, it was about staying ahead of the changes, adapting faster than nature itself. By the time the first real snowstorm hit, Samuel had already spent weeks perfecting his technique. The meat pit was buried deep, almost too deep for the average person to think it would work. The work had been grueling, hours spent in the bitter cold, carving through frozen earth and shifting heavy stones into place, ensuring every piece was as secure as possible. But now, with the storm settling in around him, Samuel could feel the weight of his creation. The wind howled fiercely, sending flurries of snow whipping through the dense forest surrounding his cabin. It was the kind of storm that could last for days, burying men and their equipment under a blanket of snow, leaving them stranded until the thaw. In these moments, survival came down to preparation and instinct. Samuel had no illusions. The storm could break him just as easily as it had broken others before him, but he knew his pit would stand the test. As the storm intensified, Samuel worked quickly inside his cabin, finishing the final touches on his winter supplies. His traps were set, his rifles cleaned, and his shelter reinforced. But his thoughts always returned to the pit, buried under the snow and earth, holding what little food he had left. He could almost feel the pulse of life from within it, the cold keeping the meat fresh even as the storm outside threatened to undo everything. He had learned through trial and error that in the mountains, food storage wasn't just about keeping things cold, it was about maintaining an environment where nature itself couldn't interfere. The pit was the answer, an innovation born out of necessity. He had already tested it in smaller ways, seeing how it held up through the first few frosts. Now, with the snowstorm in full force, he was about to see how it would hold up under the fiercest conditions. The storm raged on for 3 days, burying the landscape in a thick layer of snow. Yet through it all, Samuel felt a rare sense of security. His meat was safe. The pit had withstood the battering winds, the heavy snow, the freezing temperatures. It had held firm, just as he had hoped. When the storm finally passed, leaving a pristine silence behind, Samuel made his way to the pit. He removed the stone cover and looked down into the cold, dark depths where his food had been kept frozen solid. There was no sign of spoilage, no hint of thawing. The pit had done its job. Samuel smiled grimly to himself, knowing that this would be the key to his survival in the coming months. But he also knew the wilderness was never done testing him. With the storm over and his meat safe, the next challenge would be around the corner. The mountain was always watching, always waiting. The days following the storm were silent, a strange, almost eerie calm settling over the land. The once bitter winds had subsided, replaced by the soft crunch of fresh snow beneath Samuel's boots as he walked the outskirts of his small cabin. He could hear the distant cry of a lone wolf echoing through the valley, a reminder that life continued in the harsh landscape, indifferent to his struggles. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, Samuel's attention shifted back to the meat pit. He had proven his idea in theory, but in the wilderness, even the most well-thought-out plan could be undone by nature's unpredictability. His pit, as reliable as it had been through the storm, would face a new test: time. The deep cold was one thing. The slow thaw in the spring would be something else entirely. He needed to ensure his method worked not just for a few weeks but for months. The task was simple in concept: maintain the meat's preservation. But in practice, it was far more complicated. The pit had to be checked regularly, but without disturbing the delicate equilibrium of frozen earth and stone that had been so carefully built. He knew that even the smallest miscalculation could cause the meat to spoil, leaving him vulnerable. It was during one of these checks, as he removed the stone lid to check on the meat's condition, that Samuel noticed something unexpected. There, just beneath the fresh layer of snow that had accumulated over the past few days, was a set of tracks. Animal tracks, large, unmistakable bear tracks, the kind that spelled trouble for any prospector. A cold shiver ran down Samuel's spine. The bear had already tested his cabin door once, earlier in the season, but he had assumed that the beast had moved on. After all, the weather was harsh, and the food would be scarce. But the tracks, clearly fresh, spoke of an animal far more determined than he had anticipated. It was a warning. Instinctively, Samuel crouched down and traced the tracks, studying them. The bear had circled the pit, sniffing around the edges, pawing at the snow. It was clear that the animal was curious, but more than that, it was persistent. Samuel stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. This was the kind of challenge he had expected. The wilderness had a way of forcing a man to confront his weaknesses, and it was clear the bear would stop at nothing to get to the meat he had worked so hard to preserve. The bear wasn't just testing the pit, it was trying to figure out how to break it. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, the weight of the situation settling on him. His pit had held against the storm, but this was something else. A hungry bear could tear through anything if it was motivated enough. Turning back toward his cabin, Samuel didn't feel fear. He had lived through too much in the wilderness to fear the dangers of the wild. Instead, he felt a cold, calculated determination. He had created a solution, and now it had to work. There would be no turning back. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. The bear's tracks weighed heavily on his mind, and the constant howl of the wind outside kept him from finding any rest. He sat by the fire, the only warmth in his small cabin, staring into the dancing flames. The logs on the hearth cracked and popped, sending a few stray embers swirling upward into the chimney. But his mind was elsewhere. For years, Samuel had lived alone in the mountains, each day a test of his skills and ingenuity. He had built his life around the relentless need to survive, to outthink the wilderness at every turn. But now, it seemed, nature had found its way around him. The pit, his greatest creation, was being tested by forces beyond his control. He had no illusions about the bear. It wasn't some mindless animal wandering through the woods. This bear was hunting, driven by hunger, and it was not going to stop until it found a way into that meat pit. Samuel had seen the marks around the cabin, the places where the beast had tried to force its way in. He knew that the bear would test the pit again and again until it succeeded. The bear wasn't just curious anymore, it was relentless. The next day, after checking on the meat and reinforcing the stones around the pit, Samuel turned his attention to a new project, securing his supplies. He had to keep the bear at bay, and that meant doing more than just protecting the pit. He needed to fortify every possible entry point, prepare for every possible attack. His first task was to reinforce the walls of his cabin. The bear's earlier attempt at breaking through had left marks, scratches that ran down the logs and left them splintered. Samuel couldn't afford to ignore this. He began by stacking rocks along the base of the cabin, layering them as an additional barrier. He worked through the afternoon, hauling stone after stone to reinforce the walls, his muscles burning with every movement. By evening, he had completed the first layer of protection. It wouldn't stop the bear if it came with enough force, but it would slow it down long enough for Samuel to react. That was the key: time. The longer the bear spent trying to break through, the more likely Samuel was to hear it coming. But it wasn't just the cabin that needed attention. The pit, the heart of his survival plan, needed protection too. Samuel carefully examined the stone cover once again, adjusting it, making sure the weight was evenly distributed, the cracks sealed. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. The bear could dig, could claw its way through the snow and dirt if it wanted to. In the hours before nightfall, Samuel set traps around the meat pit, simple snares, rigged to catch the bear's paws or force it to retreat before it could do real damage. He wasn't sure how effective they would be. The bear had already shown it could outsmart him once before, but desperation breeds innovation, and Samuel was nothing if not a survivor. The traps set, he returned to his cabin. That night, his sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of wild animals clawing at his walls, of nature itself coming to claim what it had been denied. He had spent years in the wild, but for the first time, he felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in on him and the knowledge that his greatest challenge was still ahead. The bear was out there, and tomorrow Samuel would have to face it. The following days were a blur of tension and preparation. Samuel could feel the bear's presence every time he stepped outside his cabin, the hairs on the back of his neck rising at the slightest noise. He could hear the deep thud of heavy paws in the distance, the echo of the bear's growls in the stillness of the early mornings. The animal had tested him before, but now it was a matter of when, not if, it would return. Each day, Samuel checked the pit, carefully inspecting every trap and every stone. The meat inside remained frozen, preserved by the cold earth and the careful design of the pit. But Samuel knew it wouldn't last forever. Spring would come, and with it, the slow thaw that would turn his carefully crafted system into a liability if he wasn't ready. The bear was a pressing danger, but it was also a countdown. The clock was ticking. By the fourth day after the first attack, Samuel knew that he couldn't wait any longer. The bear would be back soon, and he needed to be ready. He spent the morning gathering his supplies, his rifle, extra powder, and his hunting knife. He didn't plan on killing the bear, at least not yet, but he needed to be able to defend himself. If the animal tried to force its way into the pit again, Samuel wouldn't hesitate. He moved methodically, preparing the cabin as best as he could, checking the windows, securing any weak spots in the structure. He didn't know what kind of attack the bear would make, but he had learned that a lack of preparation often led to catastrophe. His traps were reset, but the one thing that he hadn't considered was the bear's intelligence. The beast would likely come from a different angle this time, perhaps from behind the cabin, where it could avoid the traps. As night fell, Samuel sat at the edge of his cabin, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness behind. The world felt too quiet. The Silence heavy with anticipation, Samuel's breath came in shallow bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sounds of the wilderness, the soft rustle of a tree branch swaying in the wind, the distant howl of wolves, but the bear's movements were silent, deliberate. Then, just as he had feared, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the woods. Samuel's heart stopped for a moment as he saw the shape of the bear materialize out of the darkness. The animal was enormous, its fur matted with snow, its eyes glowing with hunger and determination. It approached the pit cautiously, its massive paws crunching through the frozen ground, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of the meat. This was it, the moment Samuel had been waiting for. He gripped his rifle tighter, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The bear circled the pit, its sharp claws scraping against the stone, testing its defenses once more. But Samuel was ready. With a deep breath, he rose, from his crouched position, aiming his rifle at the bear. The wilderness was testing him once again, but this time Samuel had the advantage. His ingenuity had brought him this far. Now, it would be his will that determined whether he would survive the final test. The night was frozen still, as if the world itself held its breath in the face of the impending conflict. Samuel stood just outside the cabin, rifle raised, eyes locked on the massive shape of the bear as it circled his carefully constructed meat pit. His heart thudded in his chest, matching the heavy beat of the animal's steps. For a moment, time seemed to stretch out, every second magnified in the icy silence of the night. This was the moment, the test that had been brewing ever since Samuel first conceived the idea of the pit. The bear, massive and full of brute force, sniffed the air, its dark eyes scanning the surroundings. Its hulking body moved with calculated precision, every movement in tune with its purpose. It had been around before, Samuel knew, testing the defenses, learning, observing, but now it had come to finish what it had started. The primal hunger in its gaze was unmistakable. Samuel held his breath. He didn't want to fire, not yet. He knew that shooting would only provoke a dangerous escalation. His rifle could kill the beast, but it would also risk breaking the tenuous balance between them. A bear could easily tear through the cabin walls if it felt threatened, and Samuel's carefully laid plans, the reinforced cabin, the meat pit, would be meaningless if he couldn't outwit the animal. The bear's nose twitched as it caught the scent of the frozen meat below. It wasn't the first time it had smelled this feast. The temptation was too much. The bear lowered its head, massive paws digging into the snow-covered earth, testing the edges of the pit, trying to find the weak points in the stone structure. Samuel's hands shook slightly as he gripped the rifle tighter. He was cold, too cold, but it wasn't just the mountain's chill that made him shiver. It was the realization that, for all his preparation, all his efforts, he was facing something beyond his control. The wilderness didn't bend to human ingenuity. It was wild, untamed, and it demanded respect. The bear let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the crisp air. It was testing the stone cover again, pushing with all its might. Samuel could hear the scrape of its claws against the rock, and he knew that it wasn't far from breaking through. The weight of the situation hit him. If the bear succeeded, it would ruin him. All the work, all the careful thought that had gone into this, would be undone in a matter of moments. His only hope now was to scare it off. With a sudden, explosive movement, Samuel lifted his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot shattered the stillness of the night, echoing through the valley. The bear stopped in its tracks, its body stiffening in surprise. The growl turned into a low, menacing snarl as the beast turned its head toward Samuel's position. The immediate shock of the gunshot faded, and the bear's gaze shifted from the pit to the man. Samuel didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time hitting the snow just short of the bear's feet. The blast of noise sent the bear into a frenzy, and it recoiled, roaring in fury. The creature's eyes blazed with primal rage, its body coiling as if ready to charge. Samuel's heart raced as he took a step back, but his rifle remained steady, aimed squarely at the beast. The bear took one more look at the meat pit, then at Samuel, before it made a decision. With a final snarl, it backed away, its enormous body slowly retreating into the night, its growls fading into the distance. Samuel didn't lower his rifle immediately. He waited, watching the shadows where the bear had disappeared. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his chest heaving as the adrenaline finally started to wear off. The wilderness had tested him, and he had passed. But Samuel knew this was far from over. He had survived this encounter, but the bear would return. It would return, and it would come stronger, angrier, and more determined than ever. The true test was not just surviving this moment, it was ensuring that when the bear came back, Samuel would be ready. He stepped back into the cabin, securing the door behind him. As he settled in front of the fire, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it was fleeting. The bear had shown its hand, and Samuel knew it would be only a matter of time before the real battle began, and when it did, Samuel would have to be more than just ready. He'd have to outsmart the wilderness itself. The next morning, the sun barely broke over the horizon, casting weak rays through the heavy blanket of clouds that still hung low in the sky. The storm had passed, but the air was still bitterly cold, and the ground was packed solid beneath the thin layer of snow. Samuel stood at the doorway of his cabin, staring out into the white expanse, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The events of the night before still reverberated in his mind, a stark reminder of the wild's power and unpredictability. The bear had retreated, for now, but Samuel knew it wasn't over. The wilderness didn't let go of its prey that easily. As he walked toward the meat pit, he felt a deep, gnawing unease in his chest. He had survived the night, but he wasn't sure how long that survival would last. The bear would be back. He could feel it in his bones. When he reached the pit, Samuel immediately noticed the signs of the previous night's struggle. The stone cover had been shifted again, and the edges of the pit were littered with broken branches and claw marks. It was clear that the bear hadn't given up easily. The tracks leading away from the pit were deeper than the night before, indicating the animal's frustration and anger. Samuel knelt beside the pit, inspecting the damage. The meat was still frozen, thank God, but the cover had been shifted enough that it might be more difficult to replace in the coming days. The snow around the pit was crushed, flattened by the bear's heavy paws. The creature was relentless, and it would stop at nothing to get what it wanted. He cursed under his breath, knowing that there was no way to truly protect the pit from another assault. The traps, though effective, couldn't guarantee that the bear wouldn't find another way in. His rifle could stop the bear, but only for a moment. And Samuel wasn't sure how many times he could fire off warning shots before the animal became too aggressive to scare off. There was no time to waste. Samuel needed to rethink his strategy, but he didn't have many options. The pit had been his lifeline, the one thing keeping him from starvation. If the bear got to it, Samuel would be left with little more than his wits and the dwindling supplies in his cabin. With a heavy sigh, Samuel stood up, looking out over the wilderness. He had no choice but to move the pit. It would take time, more effort than he had hoped, but it was the only way to ensure his survival. The bear had found the pit once, and it would find it again if he didn't take action. He could try to reinforce the existing location, but that was only a temporary solution. He needed a new site, one even more secure than the first. The problem was the land itself. Finding a new place to bury the pit would require careful thought. It had to be a spot that was hidden, out of sight from the bear. The terrain had to be just right, no lowlands where the snow would settle too heavily, no rocky outcroppings that might make digging more difficult. Samuel needed somewhere that would keep the meat frozen but also away from prying animal eyes. He had to think quickly. The bear would be back soon. And this time, Samuel wasn't going to be caught off guard. Samuel didn't waste any time. He spent the next several days scouring the area for the perfect location to move his meat pit. It wasn't an easy task. The land around his cabin was rough, filled with jagged rocks and thick brush. Even with his years of experience in the mountains, finding a place that met all his needs seemed impossible. He needed a spot where the temperature remained consistently low, where the snow wouldn't melt and expose the pit to the eyes of predators. He also needed something with enough cover to keep the bear from detecting his scent and finding the new location. The land had to be remote, far from the trails and the places where animals might frequent. After hours of searching, Samuel found a secluded spot in a narrow valley, sheltered by towering pines on one side and a steep rock face on the other. The valley was deep enough that the sun barely touched the ground, keeping the temperature consistently low even during the day. The snow was thick and untouched here, undisturbed by animal tracks or the wind. It was the perfect spot. Samuel set to work immediately, digging into the frozen earth with renewed purpose. The ground was harder here, the permafrost thicker, but he had tools now, and he was determined. His muscles burned with effort as he carved through the ice, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He dug deep, deeper than he had before, pushing through the layers of earth and ice to create a pit that would keep the meat frozen for months. It took him 2 full days to complete the new pit. He was exhausted, his body sore from the constant strain, but the satisfaction of a job well done was worth the pain. Once the pit was finished, Samuel carefully packed the meat inside, just as he had done before, and covered it with stones and snow. This time, he made sure to create a more secure seal, ensuring that the bear wouldn't be able to shift the stone cover easily. With the new pit secured, Samuel stood back and surveyed his work. The location was perfect. The bear would never find it here. He could rest easy, at least for now. But Samuel knew that survival in the wilderness was always temporary. The seasons changed, the animals grew bolder, and the landscape itself shifted with every passing storm. He had learned one important thing. No matter how carefully you plan, nature will always find a way to test you, and the wilderness would continue to test him until the end. But Samuel wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a final glance at the new pit, Samuel turned and made his way back to his cabin. The bear would have to look elsewhere for food. Samuel had won this round, but the game was far from over. Weeks passed and Samuel's new pit remained untouched. The bear hadn't returned, and the mountain had settled into a tense peace. Yet, every night, Samuel lay awake, knowing the wilderness had not forgotten him. He had won a small victory, but he could feel the next challenge looming. Survival was always a game of patience, and he knew the mountain's dangers never truly ceased. With the land growing colder and the snow deepening, Samuel prepared for the inevitable. He wasn't just protecting his food now, he was protecting his very life. The bear would return, and he'd be ready. Years passed, and the mountain slowly surrendered its secrets to Samuel. He lived on, a man shaped by the land, always one step ahead of the dangers around him. His methods spread among the few trappers left in the region, earning him a quiet respect. Samuel never sought fame or recognition. He simply wanted to survive. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy, one not written in books or monuments, but in the silent testament of survival, his meat pit still frozen in the deep valley. Long after he was gone, the wilderness would remember his ingenuity and persistence.